What I'd like to take a quick look at today is how Joseph Campbell's scheme of things, as outlined in Hero with a Thousand Faces, applies to the neurotic disturbances or the neurotic mental health conditions, such as depression, anxiety, OCD, anorexia, the phobias, perfectionism, and that whole spectrum of suffering which affects so many people. What we can say about Joseph Campbell's scheme of things is that it's not a rational, logical, or what we normally think of as scientific in its approach, because what we normally want is something which will account for neurosis in terms of a theory, a model, a framework, etc., etc. But we can't really do that. We can't really do that, even though we keep on trying to do it and we'd like to do it, because theories are neurosis and models are neurosis. So we can't really explain neurosis in terms of neurosis. That's not really a road that's going to get us very far. So it's a good thing that Joseph Campbell's scheme isn't like that. It isn't a logical, rational framework which will account for the neurotic health disturbances and also, as well as accounting for them, guide us in steps that we can take to remedy them. It's good. That's a good thing. It's a good thing because we can't really use a neurosis to help guide us in how to remedy a neurosis. It doesn't take an awful lot to realise that that isn't ever going to work. What Joseph Campbell sets out in mythological terms is this idea that neurotic suffering, even though he doesn't specifically talk about this in mental health terms, it's very much implicit. What he says is that when we stay within the domain of the known, which isn't his phrase, but when we stay within the safe zone, the comfort zone, the playpen, as I believe he does call it at one point, when really we should venture out beyond it and take a bit of an interest in the big wide world that's out there, kind of have a look at it and think, wow, what's that about? And take an interest in it. When we fail to do that, then we're looking at neurosis. We're looking at the whole spectrum of the neurotic disturbances of mental health in whatever way it may happen or manifest for us. And it all comes to the same thing in the end, because it all comes to the same thing in the end because it makes our existence within the playpen or the domain of the known intolerable, because there's so much suffering in it. It could make it intolerable in the sense that it's so profoundly meaningless and alienating, and it's just such a chore to carry on with it because there is nothing coming back to us, no sense of joy or excitement about what we're doing. Or it could become intolerable to us because even the simplest thing becomes so fraught with anxiety and worry that we can't take a step forward without getting paralysed by checking up on ourselves and worrying about how things may go wrong for us if we don't proceed in the right way. So what's caused our suffering in this case, if we carry on looking at things this way, Joseph Campbell's way, in the mythological way, is our refusal to take any interest at all in the bigger picture. Now, this isn't right for us. Clearly, it isn't right for us. It goes against what it means to be a human being, to be stuck in some kind of suffocating little bubble of the known and absolutely have zero interest in anything outside of that. And the bubble of the known pretty much comes down to the self and its concerns, the self and its entertainments, the self and its pastimes. Which isn't to say that there's anything inherently wrong in the self and its world of entertainment or pastimes. But that when the whole of existence, the whole of our existence, becomes nothing more than this, nothing more than the ego or self's entertainment, then we've got a problem there, because reality doesn't actually come into it. It's just the self feeding on itself and going round in circles. And there's nothing else. There's only the self. We are at that point existing within the seamless circle of the self, to paraphrase William Gibson. The seamless universe of the self, I think he says. So there's no cracks, there's no seams. It's just the self going around in circles in a world made up of itself. And we know just as soon as we articulate it like that, that there's something not very pleasant about that. There's something not very pleasant about it at all. And the thing about this is that what we're talking about here, it does sound very familiar, because we can all think of people we know and ourselves at times who don't have any interest in the bigger picture, and that are perfectly content within the small realm of the ego's entertainments and diversions and distractions. We can picture that very well indeed, because it's a very, very common thing. And we're probably not going too much out on a limb to say that at this point in humanity's history, we're much more like that than we ever were. Much more. And the reason we're much more like that than we ever were, because we've invested all of our thinking power, all of our resources into creating a world for ourselves, which is nothing more than the giant entertainment system for the ego. We've invested our powers in this project, and we definitely do have substantial powers. We have managed to manifest this world that we have been toying with, which is a world of entertainment for the ego. That doesn't mean that the entertainment's always pleasant. Entertainment can be unpleasant as well. It just means that our attention is absorbed by it, and absorbed by this limited view of how things are, which means that when our attention is absorbed by a limited view of how things are, we don't have any attention left over to ever consider the bigger picture, which basically means stuff that hasn't been created by us, something that isn't our own thought projections, something that isn't made up of our own constructs. Why should we care about a world that isn't made up by ourselves or controlled by ourselves or isn't our own construct? if we don't want to? Why should we not care about the bigger picture at all if we don't want to? And these are good questions. And really the answer is, well, we shouldn't have to if we don't want to. There's no one twisting our arm to say, no, go on. What's wrong with you? Take a look at the bigger picture, and slapping us around the head. Because we are free. We are free to do as we will in this life. Freedom is given to us. In just the same way that rope is given to us. And it can just the same way happen that we can hang ourselves with this rope, or hang ourselves with the freedom that's been given to us. But then we're free to do that, and it's not that we're free to do it, but we're bad if we actually avail of that freedom, and that there's a moral value there. We are free to do it. And I think the best way to think about it is in terms of an experiment. We're free to make that experiment. All experiments are valid. So if I want to make the experiment of living in a solipsistic bubble of me and myself, or me and my projections, go for it. See what happens. See how it works out. From an experimental point of view, it's very interesting. It's interesting because I will learn something. An experiment doesn't matter whether an experiment proves what it seeks to prove or doesn't prove, or works or doesn't work. Experiment, even if the experiment creates a lot of suffering for us, it's still a valid experiment because we can learn. And in fact, we're far more likely to learn from suffering than we are from anything else in the end. We learn most through suffering. As the Greek tragedist said, whose name I can't remember, Aeschylus, I think, that wisdom comes against our will is one thing he said, and that it comes via suffering is another thing, he said. We don't like to suffer, and what's more, we don't want wisdom. But in the end, we don't have any choice about suffering, and we don't have any choice about gaining wisdom. And that's just to say that when we do make the experiment of not being interested in the bigger picture, we don't have any choice ultimately about learning from that experiment. And the more we throw ourselves into the experiment, the more we stand to learn. So definitely at this particular point in time in humanity's existence, we have collectively thrown ourselves into it in a really, really big way. So it only remains to see what happens next, to see what the outcome of the experiment's going to be. The most obvious way of talking about the outcome is to talk about suffering, mental suffering, and say that, as I did earlier, that when we throw ourselves into this particular endeavour, then we're going to suffer an awful lot, and the suffering rises and rises until it reaches a point where we just can't carry on with the endeavour, the experiment anymore, because it becomes too unbearable. Which is the way things go. That's the natural process at work there, and it can be seen that that isn't a malign process, it's a healthy process. It's not quite as simple as that, because we will do our very best to stop the suffering increasing. We will do our best to retard that suffering or limit it or make it more bearable. And then that changes things, because we don't reach that ceiling where we have to let go of the whole damn thing. We kind of hover about. Things are pretty intolerable, but kind of tolerable at the same time in a kind of a way. We can get used to it and carry on like that. And it's clear enough that if that's what we do, then we've thwarted the natural healing process. We've cleverly interrupted it so it can't get to where it was going. And where it was going is a point where we would actually be liberated from the experiment. Or where it was going is the point where we actually become wise to what's happening and what we're doing and why we're doing. Why what we're doing isn't such a great thing after all. And of course, having said this, the next thing to come to is the fact that what we do under the banner of mental health is precisely this. We try to we try to control the suffering and bring it down before we can learn what it is that we were going to learn. And the outcome of this is never that we go back to the happy-go-lucky state where we were able to live in the neurotic world or live in the playpen without feeling the sting or the pinch in any way. And that's what we want to do. We want to have our toys mended so we can go back to the playpen and play with them, as Anthony de Mello says. We don't want to grow up, as Anthony de Mello also says. We just go to the psychotherapist to fix our toys. Please, can I go back to the playpen and play with my toys like I was before, please? So we're hankering for that. We're nostalgic. We're hankering to go back to the playpen. Back in the days when the playpen was a great place to be in, or at least it seems to be a wonderful place from the perspective of where we are now, which is being in the playpen but feeling the pinch big time. So very often I imagine the psychotherapist who has been called upon to fix the toys will try to do just that. Some psychotherapists won't. Others will. And that's fair enough as well. If we just totally want to have our toys fixed and that's all we're interested in, that's fine. So we go to the fixing therapy, the adjustment therapy, to readjust us, to get us back to playing the game again as if nothing had happened, as if we had never learned anything about the game, which we haven't. We wouldn't have done in that case. Or rather, what we would have learned, we would have pretended that we don't know. It's a question of whether we want to wake up or not wake up, as in the Matrix. Which pill do we want? And whichever pill you want, that's the one to go for, obviously, at the end of the day. So it's fair to say that psychotherapists don't always support us in our growth. Sometimes they might support us in our desire not to grow, because that's what we're going to be paying the money for, really. So we get what we pay our money for. But moving aside from psychotherapy, which is a minor thing really, because most people don't see psychotherapists, we have the mental health industries. We have psychiatry and all of the rational therapies. So in this case, without any doubt at all, we can see very clearly that the mental health industries are all about getting us back to where we were before, which seemed so great at the time. The mental health industries are all about fixing our toys. And there can be no real argument about that. I don't see how anyone's going to come and sensibly try to argue against that. What the mental health industries want to do is kind of what we want them to do, which is to fix us, interrupt the hero's journey before it even starts, and bring us back to the playpen, where we can play away happily as if the playing in the playpen was a legitimate thing to do. Now, it is a legitimate thing to do at the start. When we're kids, it's legitimate. We're not going to come up to some kid and start yelling at them and saying, "What are you doing playing in the playpen, boy? Well, go. Get out there into the world and learn something." We're not going to do that. But when we're 20, 30, 40, we shouldn't be in the playpen anymore. Not meaning shouldn't in a moral sense, but in the sense that if we are still in the playpen and we are still ignoring the bigger picture and concerning ourselves entirely with the domain of the known, then in that case we're going to be experiencing what Joseph Campbell calls a negative adventure. An adventure in boredom, which isn't really that much of an adventure at all. An adventure in boredom, frustration and futility. In a way, it's an adventure because we're experiencing what life is like when we stick firmly within the domain of the known as if there was no other domain. But in another way, it's not an adventure because nothing new is happening. It's just we're not breaking through any boundaries. We're not moving beyond the known. We're just suffering within the known. So there we have this very interesting way of looking at what our collective response to neurotic suffering is. We try our best to work with it, to fix it, or to make it better. But because we're seeing it in a pathological way, i.e. something that needs to be corrected, not the beginning of wisdom, no matter how clever or resourceful we get, this is cleverness or resourcefulness that is working against us. In other words, the smarter we get, the worse it is for us. And that is precisely our situation in the West, where we are in the process of getting very smart, in inverted commas, indeed, and making it a lot worse for ourselves. Okay, thanks for watching.